Morality, according to the philosopher Max Stirner, is just another spook. And if you clicked on this video, you likely already know what that means. But let me say it again. A spook is a phantom concept. It's something that compels us to cling to ideas and structures that dictate behavior and thought. But according to Stirner, it's a fabrication that only exists as long as we believe in it. In this video, I make the claim that ethical systems, systems that base their fundamental structures on what is right or wrong, based on concepts of virtue, justice, and the common good, are actually spooks. And explaining why is actually not that easy, but I want to try. And I want to get somewhat personal and tell you about my very own egoistic way of determining wrong and right. But that one won't be uploaded until Sunday. Today, I want to show you the spook of ethical systems by using the example of political correctness.
Okay, class, let's take roll. Shithead? It's Shafi!
So in relation to ethics, Max Stirner's views are deeply skeptical and individualistic. He argues that ethical systems, whether rooted in religion, society, or philosophical principles, are forms of external authority that constrain autonomy. In The Ego in Its Own, or The Unique in Its Property, Stirner critiques these ethical systems as spook or abstract ideals. Stirner claims that ethical concepts like duty, morality, and altruism are not inherent truths, but social constructs that impose limits on what he calls ownness, or Eigenheit in German. His focus on ownness represents an ethical perspective that's radically subjective. It's not bound by any universal rules or obligations to others. Instead, Stirner's ethics are egoistic, meaning they are centered on self-interest and the pursuit of personal goals driven by personal desire. However, in that, he does not advocate for a chaotic or hedonistic lifestyle, though his views could be and have been interpreted this way. Rather, he sees ethical behavior as a matter of personal choice, and personal choice as a conscious alignment with one's own desires. Now, most people hear this and think, oh wow, cool, some edgy dude who thinks disregarding others is a good way to live. And this is what some of his contemporaries thought even back in the day. Think about Marx's Saint Max. But Stirner's philosophy is actually more complex than most people give it credit for. Stirner doesn't actually encourage disregard for others, nor does he advocate for hedonistic self-servitude, pragmatic self-actualization. Instead, he proposes that individuals relate to each other out of voluntary union, or Verein, as he calls it, formed for mutual benefit rather than moral duty. In this sense, ethics becomes a tool of self-interest rather than a moral absolute, with the union supporting the individual's quest. Max Stirner's view on ethics radically opposes some of the traditional moral frameworks, which I would say our modern society is still based on to this day, such as Kant's duty-based categorical imperative, utilitarianism's emphasis on collective happiness, Aristotle's focus on communal virtue, and Hegel's idea of ethical life within social institutions. But let's look into what they thought about ethics, and then get back to Stirner after that. Aristotle, one of the earliest influential philosophers on ethics, introduced the concept of virtue ethics in his text, Nicomachean Ethics. He basically said that the development of good character would lead to a fulfilling and flourishing life. So the argument is that moral virtues like courage, temperance, and justice are cultivated through habits that align with reason, rather than strict rules. So basically, he believed that ethical behavior involved practicing these virtues from a reasonable perspective, which comes from finding a balance between extremes. For instance, finding the balance between recklessness and cowardice. Another aspect of the rationale behind virtue ethics is the claim that ethical development is inherently social. So individuals learn and refine virtues within a community. So in his thought, society was essential for cultivating good habits and virtues, with the best societies promoting the virtues virtues necessary for individuals to live well together. So according to Aristotle, morality is about both individual character and communal well-being, and he emphasizes that people are naturally inclined to contribute to the greater good. Centuries later, Immanuel Kant shifted the focus of ethics from the idea of character and communal well-being to the idea of duty and universal principles. In his critique of practical reason and groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, he argued that morality is grounded in reason and not in personal aspirations. He introduced what he called the categorical imperative, which is basically a rule that states that one should act only according to maxims that could be universalized as laws for all rational beings. This means an action is moral if, and only if, it could be consistently applied to everyone without contradiction. Kant claimed that true moral actions are those performed out of duty, regardless of personal consequences or inclinations. He emphasized respect for others as ends in themselves, meaning that every person has intrinsic worth and should never be treated merely as a means to an end. So society, in Kant's view, benefits when individuals adhere to moral duties grounded in universal principles, because this consistency creates a just and equitable framework for human interaction. As industrial society developed, utilitarianism emerged as a consequentialist approach to ethics. This was spearheaded by Jeremy Bentham, and later was expanded by John Stuart Mill. Bentham proposed that actions should be judged by their utility, which is just another way of saying their ability to produce pleasure or avoid pain. Mill refined this view by distinguishing between higher and lower pleasures, and he argued that some forms of happiness, like intellectual or moral pleasures, are more valuable than mere physical satisfaction, for example. So utilitarianism basically seeks to maximize happiness or well-being for the greatest number, which obviously means that individuals have to prioritize collective interests over personal desires. This view envisions society as a collective where the moral worth of an action is based on its potential to improve overall happiness. For instance, a utilitarian might argue that redistributing resources from the wealthy to the poor increases overall happiness, even if it limits individual wealth. In the early 19th century, Hegel introduced a more socially embedded view of ethics, which he called Sittlichkeit, or translated as ethical life, in his philosophy of right. Hegel argued that freedom and moral fulfillment are achieved not in isolation, but through participation in social institutions like family, civil society, and the state. These institutions represent ethical structures that reflect collective values, and they help individuals understand their own role within a broader societal context. What this means is he believed that ethical systems should emphasize the act of reconciling personal and collective goals, which would allow individuals to find self-realization while also contributing to society. Society, in this view, is a network of ethical relations that guide individuals towards self-fulfillment and mutual respect. Hegel felt that Kant's ethical system was far too abstract and lacked connection to lived social reality. So instead, he advocated for a morality that organically tied to one's place in society, where ethical obligations are grounded in specific roles or relationships. Nietzsche's view on ethical systems is a demolition of all that came before it. Here are the main aspects of it. In terms of morality, he distinguished between two types of morality: master morality and slave morality. Master morality is rooted in noble classes, values, strengths, vitality, and self-affirmation, which defines noble qualities like courage and resilience. In contrast, slave morality emerges from the weaker segments of society, which value humility and compassion as a response to the powerful, often portraying the strong as evil to undermine them. So overall, Nietzsche rejects the simple good versus evil framework. He actually proposed another idea, moving beyond good and evil, where ethics arise from personal authenticity rather than imposed norms. This approach demands a critical revaluation of inherited values, meaning he encouraged the empowerment of individuals to create their own ethical paths. He also talked about his principle of amor fati, or love of fate, which is about radical acceptance of life in all its facets and plays into the idea of revaluing our ideas of what is wrong and what is right. The idea here is to offer a more positive example of a life where one can live without resentment or regret, regardless of adherence to social value systems or lack thereof. In the 20th century, existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir offered a view on ethics which is actually similar or maybe based on Nietzsche's framework. This concept of ethics is all about individual freedom and the rejection of fixed moral codes. Existentialists argue that meaning and values are not given by society or universal principles, but that individuals must create their own purpose and make authentic choices in a world without inherent moral structure. So, existentialists emphasize the weight of personal responsibility in an indifferent or even absurd universe, where traditional moral systems are often seen as empty or constraining. So in this framework, ethics becomes a deeply personal endeavor, where individuals navigate choices without relying on societal or religious prescriptions. But more than that, which technically is something that Nietzsche already mentioned, existentialism in its many forms really stresses the importance of authenticity, or in other words, living in accordance with one's true self, rather than conforming to societal expectations. And in the case of Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, they use this framework to come up with an ethical foundation for that kind of ambiguity, which is what Simone de Beauvoir tried to do in her book, The Ethics of Ambiguity. In this text, she tries to come up with an existentialist ethical structure based on the acceptance of life's inherent ambiguity. She basically explains that we have to embrace the paradox of being both free subjects and influenced by external forces. So basically, all ethical action means recognizing that our freedom is intertwined with others, and the only real ethical imperative would be to act in ways that promote collective liberation, to become free to define one's own path and code. She describes different ways people respond to freedom, some by avoiding it, others by clinging to rigid values, but she ultimately calls for an ethic of continual self-transcendence that respects and affirms freedom for all. Max Stirner happened somewhere in between. In the context of these ethical frameworks, his egoism can either be seen as standing out for its radical approach of rejecting all external standards and moral obligations, or it can be seen as a precursor for this kind of thought. But I think Stirner went a little further than even Nietzsche and de Beauvoir by detaching his approach completely from all possible spooks. He argued that the spook of morality is inherently tied to other spooks, which these philosophers failed to identify as such. This includes Aristotle's virtue, Kant's reason, Bentham and Mill's happiness, Hegel's guidance, Nietzsche's self-actualization, and de Beauvoir's freedom. Stirner showed us that all we are actually capable of doing is to pursue our own interests, and that for that to even really work, we would need to radically break free from the psychological and social forces that bind us to these images and ideas.
That is offensive!
I'm going to use the example of political correctness to explain this stance. Political correctness refers to a set of social norms that dictate how individuals should speak and behave in order to avoid offending others in a social setting, particularly with regard to things like race, gender, sexuality, and other marginalized identities. It's often seen as an attempt to create a more inclusive society by means of controlling sociolinguistic norms. Its core idea is that the way we speak and act impacts social dynamics, and therefore it becomes ethically important to avoid perpetuating stereotypes which could potentially marginalize groups or reinforce oppressive power structure. In many ways, political correctness has been hailed as an important force for social good because it attempts to foster a more just and equitable world. It urges individuals to be mindful of their language and actions because it can shape societal discourse with an emphasis on compassion and respect for all people. The values behind political correctness stem from a concern for the concept of dignity and social responsibility. And the basic idea is that words matter because they reflect and shape the way we perceive and treat others, which certainly is not untrue. In this way, political correctness, as an action related to a specific ethical framework, acknowledges a fundamental notion of Lacanian psychoanalysis, the power of the symbolic order. And nowadays, thinkers like Slavoj Žižek point out the problem with political correctness using this Lacanian framework to do so. For Žižek, political correctness is not just a well-meaning attempt to create a more respectful society, but it's actually a form of ideological control that disguises the real problems without confronting them head-on. So in Žižek's eyes, political correctness in its current form becomes a tool that maintains the status quo under the guise of progressiveness. By focusing on language and symbolic gestures rather than addressing the underlying issues, such as economic inequality, racial tensions, and structural oppression, political correctness becomes a means of control, which pretty much ensures that people feel like they're doing something without actually changing anything. He uses the example of a father telling his child to visit their grandmother and compares the traditional, direct, quote-unquote, do it because I said so, with the more progressive approach of, quote, you should do this because it's what will make your grandmother and also yourself happy. In both cases, the child is coerced into the same action, but the second method disguises this coercion as a matter of free will. Žižek argues that this form of gentler authoritarianism is far more dangerous because it operates under the surface. In Lacanian terms, the symbolic represents the realm of language structures and cultural codes. It's the system that organizes our reality and shapes our subjectivity. So, political correctness, when viewed through this lens, is a way of regulating the symbolic. It defines what can and cannot be said, what is considered respectful or offensive. But as Žižek points out, while political correctness regulates how we speak, it doesn't address the real or the deep, unspeakable truths and unresolved contradictions that underlie social and political life. The real, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, refers to what is outside of language and cannot be fully symbolized or represented. It's the trauma, the gap, the inconsistency in our experience of the world that can't be neatly assimilated into the symbolic order. So in this way, political correctness represents an attempt to clean up language and make it more palatable, but this approach fails to engage with the real, which includes the structural inequalities and repressed prejudices that persist despite our efforts to sanitize the discourse. So we can see then that political correctness is a way of maintaining the illusion of progress without confronting the real issues of racism, sexism, class oppression, and so forth. But what about the ethical systems mentioned before? Maybe they could explain the usefulness of political correctness. Well, let's use Lacanian psychoanalysis to see about that. For Aristotle, the development of virtue is closely tied to the community and the pursuit of balance. So political correctness here could be seen as a way to achieve that balance. But Lacanian theory suggests that virtue and ethical behavior are not simply learned or cultivated by external communal norms, but are instead mediated through the symbolic order, which just means the structure of language, law, and societal rules. The contradiction I see here is that the subject, or in other words, who we base our understanding of ourselves on, is always positioned by the other, so society, language, and culture, and desires are structured around this other's expectations. So political correctness, in its demand for proper behavior and language, can be seen as an extension of this external other that creates a kind of surplus enjoyment, as Zizek calls it, in conformity. The subject's desire for acceptance or recognition within the community becomes tied into a system of social rewards and punishments, and this can distort Aristotle's ideal of cultivating virtue as a free, authentic engagement with the community. So instead, political correctness becomes a mechanism that channels desire into conformity and prevents genuine virtuous action from emerging organically. Kant's ethical system emphasizes the categorical imperative, where actions must be universalizable and performed out of duty, not based on personal desires. So political correctness could be seen here as an imposition which could in some cases diminish the freedom of individuals to act according to rational principles. But Lacan would likely critique Kant's entire model of duty, which can be seen as an imposition of the law that structures the subject's desire, which Lacan describes as the big other. Political correctness mirrors this in that it imposes an external structure that subjects must follow to be seen as morally upright. But Lacan's theory of the split subject, or the idea that we are never fully integrated with the symbolic, also means that Kant's ideal of duty becomes difficult to enact authentically. The desire for recognition from the other, so society, may force individuals to comply outwardly, but they are never truly able to fulfill this duty authentically, because their actions are shaped by the desire for approval rather than moral autonomy. Utilitarianism seeks the greatest happiness for the greatest number, so it focuses on the collective good. This aligns really well with the idea of political correctness because it's supposed to do just that. But Lacanian theory would highlight the way this principle operates within the symbolic, where societal norms structure the other's desires, and the way they are mediated through language. So while utilitarianism seeks collective well-being, Lacan would point out that the drive toward social harmony or the reduction of harm often suppresses the singularity of the desiring subject. Political correctness and its goal of reducing harm can become an overdetermination of how subjects should speak and act and leave very little room for individual pleasure or satisfaction, outside of what's collectively defined as appropriate, of course. Lacan's emphasis on desire as a lack within the subject means that the pursuit of collective well-being via political correctness may inadvertently lead to a stifling of the very individual desires that should inform ethical action. Hegel's concept of ethical life, or Sittlichkeit, emphasizes the ethical community that mediates the individual's relationship to social norms and institutions. Political correctness fits pretty well into Hegel's vision, as it seeks to reshape institutions by promoting values of equality and inclusivity. But Lacanian psychoanalysis complicates this neat little fit. Hegel's emphasis on the ethical life is grounded in social roles, and the intersubjective recognition of the other can be seen as a form of the mirror stage, where the subject's identity is formed through recognition by others. Political correctness, however, operates through the imposition of an external law that dictates how individuals should behave to receive recognition, which Lacan would argue distorts the subject's true, authentic relation to the other. So Hegel's notion of ethical life risks becoming a mechanical set of prescribed behaviors that restrict the dynamic dialectical process of becoming that Lacan describes in the formation of the subject. Nietzsche's rejection of traditional moral systems and the call to revalue all values stands in contrast to the imposition of moral norms seen in political correctness. Lacanian theory would suggest that Nietzsche's radical individualism and his critique of the law represent a challenge to the symbolic order that political correctness seeks to reinforce. So that sounds good at first. Nietzsche's emphasis on the will to power and the creation of individual values would be viewed by Lacan as an expression of the real, which escapes the symbolic order and the regulations of the other. So political correctness, in its rigidity, operates precisely within the symbolic realm and dictates acceptable norms and behaviors. So Lacan would argue that political correctness stifles the real by enforcing a structure that prevents the subject from freely creating new values, instead chaining them to predefined moral standards. So he would likely agree with Nietzsche. De Beauvoir's existentialism emphasizes freedom, authenticity, and the creation of one's own values. Lacanian psychoanalysis resonates really well with this vision of freedom, where the subject is constantly negotiating its position in relation to the other and constructing its identity through desire. However, political correctness often operates as a force that seeks to suppress authenticity in favor of communal standards. Political correctness's imposition of normative behavior, so what is offensive, what's harmful, what's respectful, can be seen as the law of the other that shapes the subject's desire in ways that compromise freedom and authenticity. So Lacan would argue that de Beauvoir's ideal of freedom through authenticity will likely become constrained by the external demands of political correctness, which dictates what is acceptable rather than allowing the individual to create their own ethical path. So again, he would likely agree with their position. While the ethical systems outlined in this video propose frameworks to guide human behavior, Stirner's philosophy represents a radical break from them. His rejection of ethics as a spook isn't just about rejecting sensitivity or social norms. It's about recognizing that all ethical systems, no matter how noble or well-intentioned, ultimately restrict the individual's pursuit of their own desires. So, political correctness, like the moral systems discussed, may claim to protect individuals from harm or discrimination, but as shown by applying a Lacanian perspective, it is also contradictory and grounded in the symbolic order, and it therefore imposes a set of rules that restrict individual expression in the name of societal good. So Stirner's approach, in contrast, would place the individual's desires, autonomy, and self-interest above all external constructs without nullifying the validity of the mentioned concepts and ideas as an egoistic choice. So in this way, Stirner's philosophy is more radical than the ethical systems discussed because it dismisses the fundamental building blocks of ethical systems altogether, even ones as radical as those proposed by Nietzsche and de Beauvoir as fundamentally spooky. It doesn't simply reframe or redefine morality, it completely dismantles it. His radical individualism or egoism doesn't seek a balance between a social good or personal desires as Aristotle or Kant might. It doesn't strive for collective happiness as utilitarianism does, nor does it search for moral meaning in social institutions as Hegel suggests, and it doesn't even acknowledge freedom or self-actualization as inherently meaningful. And that's what makes it so unique. Thank you for being here. I am going to try to publish part 2 on Sunday, which will go more into my own egoistic approach, so I will see you there.
Being good isn't always easy, no matter how hard I try. When you started sweet talking to me, you'd come and tell me everything is alright. Kiss and tell me everything is alright. And can I sneak away again tonight? The only one who could ever reach me was the son of a preacher man. The only boy who could ever teach me was the son of a preacher man. Yes, he was. He was.